Is that better? All right. Now, in my defense, I think I was probably doing pretty well even without the microphone. Am I right? Yeah, good. I'm seldom accused of being too quiet. So it's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the 2024 Venture Lecture, which is brought to you tonight by CBM and Crandall University. CBM's Venture Initiative seeks to inspire and motivate individuals and groups to reflect God's image through creative and innovative work, and to mobilize Christians to join in God's redemptive mission in the world through work. Venture is part of a growing group of God's people who believe that transformation can happen when faith and work intersect. And this is a belief that Crandall's business faculty affirms as well. At Crandall, we seek to transform lives through quality university education, firmly rooted in the Christian faith. And an important part of this mission entails demonstrating that all of life, including the sphere of work, can be understood not only as a venue in which Christians can engage meaningfully, but also one in which God can be glorified through our engagement. We were blessed last year to have Dr. Paul Stevens, Professor Emeritus at Regent College and Chair of the Institute for Marketplace Transformation, share with us a kingdom vision for the marketplace. And this year, we find ourselves once again honored to have a luminary in the realm of Christian higher education join with us. Dr. Michaela O'Donnell joined Fuller Theological Seminary in 2021 as Assistant Professor of Marketplace Leadership and serves as the Executive Director of the Max Dupree Center for Leadership. Her first book, Make Work Matter, Your Guide to Meaningful Work in a Changing World, is a reflection of Michaela's heart as both an entrepreneur and as a practical theologian, and is designed as a how-to guide for anyone walking the road of calling in a changing world. As one commentator has written, Make Work Matter is a gift to those at the beginning of their careers, for those whose jobs are changing, for the entrepreneur starting a new venture, and for anyone asking questions about how their faith and their work can illuminate one another. Michaela is the primary visionary and content creator behind the Dupree Center Road Ahead program, a 6-week experience rooted in research that is designed to help its participants gain clarity about God's calling in their lives. In addition to her academic work, she has more than 10 years of experience as a leader in the marketplace, principally as the owner and managing director of Long Winter Media, a vibrant creative agency that helps brands make a social impact through multimedia content. Dr. O'Donnell regularly writes and teaches on topics of vocation, change, innovation, creativity, faith and work, and gender dynamics. And it is my distinct pleasure this evening to invite her to come and deliver the 2024 Venture Lecture. Would you make her feel welcome tonight?
Okay, I officially want to bring you with me everywhere just to do intros. They're so warm and nice. And sometimes people are like, what's this lady's name again? So thank you for the very, very warm introduction. Hi, good evening. It's good to be with you, those in the room, those online. It's just good to see your faces. So, like he said, I am the executive director of the Max Dupree Center for Leadership. And we're actually a 25-year-old center. We've had some fits and starts the last 25 years. But my predecessor, his name's Mark Roberts. He's a kind of a big person in the faith work sphere. About 8 years ago, the center was completely out of money, out of things to do, and out of people to talk to. Not exactly great if you're trying to like make that your job. So Mark came in and Mark, that wasn't on Mark. Mark did sort of the resurrecting. Mark came in and he's a New Testament scholar. And so he said, I've got like, let me just give what I've got toward this. I'm going to start writing daily devotions. So he started writing a daily devotion called Life for Leaders. That was a really pivotal moment in the life of our center. Here's why. There's a lot of really beautiful things happening in the faith work ecosystem, really beautiful things. There's a lot of really good theology and really good paradigms and a lot of great books that have been written. And when Mark started with writing the devotions, he took a bit of a turn. And that churn was to say, the thing that the Max to Priest Center is going to do is we're going to help leaders. We're going to help people out in the marketplace. We're going to help people who work, whether it's paid or unpaid, do kind of the spiritual formation work. That's what the Dupree Center is going to do. So, what that means is that I have inherited a place. I am about 3 years into my job as executive director, inherited a place that when we talk about helping people integrate their faith and work, what we mean is like matters of the heart, the inner stuff, which means that sometimes when I go and talk, people are like, whoa, this lady is making me feel all my feelings. I thought this was going to be a faith work talk. Yes, both are the same. Okay. So that's the tone that I want to come in with. Like I said, our center, we run the cohorts that were mentioned. We have this daily devotion. We do a lot of like articles, we write books, we do research, all of those things. But my favorite parts is that I regularly get to talk with a lot of different leaders. I joked for a while with my husband that I had like a sign on my forehead, and the sign was, tell me if you're having a really hard time at work. So I would be like in the grocery store or like renting a car for our family. And then like 10 or 15 minutes later, I'd just be like sitting there with the person as they were telling me all the things that were really tough. And I was in a weird way, I was like, oh, I love this space. I love this very, very honest space that it seems like these folks don't necessarily have to be able to talk about these things. So for example, the CEO, this I met the CEO, he had just taken his company public. By the way, we're going to be if you like have a question or sometimes I'm going to like ask you a question, just like raise your hand. I asked we put the lights up so I could like see your faces. So if I ask you to jump in, don't worry, I won't like call on you individually, but that might happen. So this guy had just taken his company public. Is that a familiar phrase? Taking our company public? Okay, I see some head nods. Yeah, great. So he'd just taken his company public, and I was like, congratulations. You just did this amazing thing. How are you doing? Not great, Michaela. I'm not doing well. Ooh, why? Michaela, honestly, I can't tell you the last time I felt joy in my work. It's been so crazy and so intense. Is meeting after meeting after meeting. I mean, it was a good thing and I'm glad to be done, but I'm not okay. Or the woman who was in healthcare administration. I met her in Southeast Tennessee in the US. And I guess I gave a talk sort of like this. And I don't know what I said. And I don't think she really cared what I said. At the end of it, she was like on a mission. She's like, I've got one thing, Michaela, I want to tell you. I'm like, okay, what is it? And she said, I need you to know that my job every day gets harder and harder. They keep putting more and more on my shoulders, but my shoulders are the same size. Michaela, can you help me make it one more year? Ooh. The work is good. She knew it was good. It was just so much. Or the recent college grad who we met and he said, how do you know what God's will for your life is? I was like, well, that's a big question. And I think we're only going to have a little bit of time. I said, tell me more. What are you trying to wrestle through? And he said, my family is back in Singapore. I'm here in the States, and they'd love nothing more for me to come back and take over the family business. But I don't know that I want to do that. And I don't know how to know what God's calling me to do. It's a lot. So I'm a mother. I have two kids. One is 8 and one is 5. And when my son, who's the youngest, was 2 weeks old, I got a call. And if you've like ever been around a baby or a newborn, then 2 weeks old, that's like very fresh. No one's sleeping. It's like middle of the night kind of stuff. And I get a call from my best friend. And my best friend said to me, Michaela, I'm getting a divorce and I need to come live with you. Now, my husband and I, and our toddler, and then our newborn son, we lived in Los Angeles with like Los Angeles size housing. So we lived in this small 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. But my best friend was getting a divorce. So what do you say? Come, right? Come. So she came and she like would sleep on the couch, and every day I would like do the things one does to keep a newborn alive. And then at night, she would tell me all the things in her life. And we'd talk through all the things that were going on. And so I wasn't sleeping very much because I was spending they say when you have a baby, you're supposed to sleep when the baby sleeps. But when the baby was sleeping, I was listening to my friend. And so after several days of this arrangement, I was just feeling so tired and so spent. And I was like on the edge, right? So I called my mom, who is my person in these kind of moments. I said, Mom, this is a lot. Here's what's happening. And she said to me, Michaela, you're like a little boat and you're taking on a lot of water. And unless you intentionally let water off the boat, you're going to drown. All of the people that I mentioned, the CEO, the woman in healthcare administration, the guy who was trying to figure out if he should go back to his family business, they were taking on a lot of water, a lot of water. And it's these kind of questions, this kind of space that drives a lot of my work. A lot of my work of helping leaders integrate their faith into those kind of work decisions. So I'm a practical theologian. That's my discipline. I have a PhD in practical theology. Sometimes people are like, what is practical theology? Shouldn't all theology be practical? Or isn't no theology practical? They're like, it's always somewhere in there, right? So let me give you a breakdown just of some of the different theological disciplines. So it really, it's about starting point for inquiry. So you have like the historical theologians, they're looking at like the tradition and the history of the Christian church. You have the biblical theologians, they're starting with the Bible every time and asking questions of application. The systematic theologians who want to start with the big overarching ideas of the faith. And then you have the practical theologians. And the practical theologians want to start with what's happening in the world right now and what does the Christian faith have to say to it. So one of my driving questions over the last several years has been, how do we nurture vocation? How do we nurture meaning and purpose, particularly in work, in a changing world? A world in which, even though the work is good, joy can feel at bay. And even though we want to be doing it, our shoulders are the size they are. And even though we desperately want to know what God has for us, it's not so easy always to know what the next step should be. So one of the things we do at the Dupree Center is we do like a bunch of research projects. Now I'm gonna be 100% frank with you. I have other people on my team who are much better researchers than I am. In fact, they're always telling me things. I'm Kelly, you can't say that. Like you're generalizing, like you got to go back to the data. And so I've hired these like really, really good people who are very good at asking complex questions and looking at patterns among data set. And one of the research projects that we've been doing, I've talked about this, I've mentioned it just briefly in a couple of spaces already. I'm going to talk about it again, but mention a different aspect of it here. Is called the Flourishing Leaders Research Project. So we asked 18 focus groups worth of people 3 questions. We asked them, what does healthy leadership look like? What does fruitful leadership look like? And what does faithful leadership look like? And from that, we got like a bunch of commonalities. And then we were on the hunt to find people who kind of matched this description. So we did a bunch of in-depth interviews with a lot of really interesting people. And we found some things that now are sort of foundational to the next chapter of the work that we're doing at the Dupree Center. And I won't share all those data points with you, but I do want to share one. The leaders we talked to were guided by a sense of calling, every single one of them. They were guided by a sense of calling. But here's the thing, it wasn't a calling to lead, it was a calling to follow, to be a disciple. These are all Christian leaders. I felt like, okay, are we doing a project on Christian leadership and what that looks like across industries? Or are we doing a project on discipleship? Or are those maybe the same thing? So I want to unpack this idea of vocation a bit. All right. I've even brought a prop. We'll see how it goes. Okay. I'm going to get my prop. I talk with a lot of people and I ask them questions like, what is calling? I find that a lot of us have very, very different ideas about what this theological concept means. I hear things like from college students to folks on the brink of retirement to people who are kind of mid-career. I hear things like vocation is the thing you were made to do, or vocation is a job that doesn't feel like work at all. Vocation is not my job. It's my art, my music, but I'm not trying to get paid for the thing that God's called me to do. So I end up doing a lot of myth busting and reframing. From my calling equals my job to my job is one place to express my sense of vocation, not the sole place where it actualizes. From my calling equals my job to my job is one place to express my sense of vocation, not the sole place where it actualizes. And we'll unpack that a bit more. From if I check all the boxes, I'll be fulfilled. This is a big one. I have found, myself included, that a lot of us are moving around with some boxes that we think if we tick those boxes, things will be good. Of course we do, right? Moving from, and one of the biggest places this comes from is both this internal sense of pressure, but honestly, also the expectation we've inherited from others. All the shoulds. I see some head nods, right? Think about it. The expectations about if you're in college, what kind of degree you should get and the work you should pursue. To the folks, we do a lot with folks who are on the brink of retirement, to what's retirement supposed to look like? And if I check these boxes of leisure, I'll be happy. Wait a minute. I'm not actually feeling so happy. I checked the boxes. What happened? From if I check all the boxes, I'll be happy, to calling is dynamic, not static. Discernment is the journey of a lifetime. What do I mean by the fact that calling is dynamic, not static? So I'm a mother of two. It's absolutely clear to me that I sense a call to be a good mother. It's clear to me that my husband and I sensed a call to move from Southern California, where it's in Fahrenheit 72 and sunny all the time, to the middle of the US, where it also could be snowing in March. But we sensed a call. But a couple calls that maybe will come to be someday, but that I don't feel strongly about right now, but that kind of reveal the dynamic nature. Think about the role of being a grandmother. I don't feel strongly a call to be a grandmother right now, but I might at some point. I don't feel strongly a sense of call to be in a different physical place, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened at some point. Calling is dynamic, not static. Because there's so much tangled up. First of all, work and vocation, work and calling get really tangled up. And those actually kind of have to be pulled apart. I like to think of them as dancing partners, but not necessarily the same thing. And a theology of vocation and a theology of work talk to each other, but aren't one and the same. Because so much is tangled up with this idea of vocation, it's been helpful for me to think about vocation with an image. And that image is a set of nesting dolls. Okay, I'm going to attempt to use the prop now. If things fall on the ground, you can be gracious. Not much table space. So in this innermost doll, the one that's nested deep inside, is the call to belong. This is the disciples on the shore of Sea of Galilee, where Jesus says, "Follow me." This is John 10. "My sheep hear my voice. They follow me. They know my name." The call to belong to God. Josh and I were talking before, and he was talking about the call to be before the call to do. Next nesting doll. For this, I want to go all the way back to Genesis, or the first call to humans to create in loving service. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Now, Josh didn't know he was going to be in my talk like 5 times tonight, but that's what happens when you talk to me right before I have to get up. We were talking about how in the age, so much is changing. And I talk about quite a bit of those changes in the book I wrote. And that book was published 3 years ago. It's like, wow, I didn't write about Chat GPT in there at all. Like the world is moving so fast. In an age where so much is getting created and so much is getting manufactured, there is a distinctly human task that we've been called to do, which is to create, particularly in loving service toward each other. Okay, next. Ooh, I haven't dropped one so far on this tiny table. The third doll. We heard this phraseology already. It's really good phraseology. The call to participate in God's mission of redemption. Going to 2 Corinthians 5 here. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Look, new things have come into being. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. I think, now let me also say this. I'm not the boss of theology. So like if I say something, you're like, I don't know, that's okay. Like bring your wonderings, bring your questions, bring your traditions to in dialogue with it, right? Don't adopt what I say as the truth forevermore. But I think that this is one of the great roles of what it means to follow Jesus. The climactic story in Christ is one in which the arc of humanity took this churn toward redemption, toward fixing what is broken, toward putting goodness in the world, toward peace and shalom. So inside, the call to belong. Next, the call to create. Then the call to participate in God's mission of redemption. And then finally, once all those dolls are nested and set, that's when you get the particulars. That's when you get the particulars. Most of us This is like not, this is no like shame on us. This is just state of the union, state of the landscape. Most of us start and end our conversations on vocation with this outer doll. But if I take out ooh, all that's nested within, what happens to this doll? It's empty. It's totally hollow. It's totally hollow. And we miss out on all that's inside. And this is, and by the way, the particulars, you can think about, I'm thinking about the story of Mary, who's called to be the mother of God, the story of Esther, who was called to stand up to the powers of the time on behalf of her people, called to places. Where am I going to live? Called to relationships. And yes, even work, but not only work. The flip here is that our starting point for vocation is not what we do for work, paid or otherwise, but our own sense of belonging. And what a time to be talking about belonging. The statistics are sobering at best, frightening at worst. We are lonely people. Loneliness is high among Gen Z. A third of people ages 45 and up feel lonely. 1/4 of folks age 65 and up are socially isolated. Across the generations, people feel without the warm kind of human connection that's so central to what we're doing. So in the US, we have this role called the Surgeon General. I think he's like the number one doctor in the land. I think it sort of reveals to you how much I know about the inner workings of the government. But he's very smart and very interesting. His name is Vivek Murthy. He went as far he went as far last year in 2023 in the US to put out an official advisory about the effects of loneliness. That kind of like opposite feeling of belonging. Here's what he wrote. Loneliness is far more than just a bad feeling. It harms both individual and societal health. It is associated with greater risk of cardiovascular diseases, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. Now, get this, the mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Sound the alarm. Our disconnection from each other, perceived and actual, is literally killing us. Now, contrast this with the findings. Anybody in here ever heard of the Harvard study of adult development? Josh, you're just like hitting home runs all night. I love it. Okay, I'll tell you about it. So it's this project out of Harvard that has followed the lives of 2 generations of adults. All right, monitoring everything from physical health levels to alcohol usage to mental well-being. Their data is sophisticated, nuanced, and is as close as comprehensive do we have, at least for the people who are in this study. In a recent book chronicling the 2 decades of research, the current research directors wrote this: to say that human beings require warm relationships is no touchy-feely idea. It's hard fact. Scientific studies have told us again and again, human beings need nutrition, we need exercise, we need purpose, and we need each other. And I want to say here that belonging, too soon, belonging gives shape to purpose. The core doll gives shape to everything else here. I want to tell you a story, and then I'm actually going to ask you a couple questions that I'm going to let you talk to each other about for a few minutes. Okay, this is a story. Actually, it's a story about coastal life. It's a story about Maine. So I'd be very curious to see how it resonates with those of you who have spent time near the water. So I've got a new book coming out in August. It's called Life in Flux. I co-wrote it with a woman named Lisa Pratt Slayton, and this is a story about her husband, Roger. So Roger grew up in Pittsburgh, but his family had a really small cottage on the coast of Maine. So he was the kind of kid that instead of saving up for his first car, he saved up for his first boat. So he finally got the money. He had a boat. And when he was 17, about 17 years old, one sunny Saturday afternoon, he went out with three of his buddies. They went out and they explored and like all the nooks and crannies, taking the boat until suddenly a really dense blanket of fog rolled in. So much so that Roger couldn't see his hand in front of him. 17-year-old boy with his friends out on the ocean. He very quickly became disoriented. He had no idea which way to go. He describes having about a half a tank of gas. So like he's got a precious resource. So what does he do? Like what tool? And like go ahead and shout it out. What tool do you think he needs? What tool is he going to use to get home? A compass. Yes, I love it. Wouldn't it be great if he had remembered to bring a compass that day? It's exactly what he should have been using. This is before GPS. So it was like compass and reading charts. So I have learned, some of you may know this, that in coastal cities, there's an entirely alternate set of navigational tools that are sound based. I see some head nods. They're sound based. And depending on where they're called foghorns and bellbuoys, and depending on where these foghorns and bellbuoys are, they have slightly different sounds, different tones that signal their location. So the thing that Roger did, he said his first instinct was like to put the boat in gear and go, right? To go. But what he did instead was he stopped the boat and he completely cut the engine. He was quite literally listening for the sounds of where he belonged. He was listening for the sounds of home. He knew that if he could hear Ocean Point, he could get back to safety. And at first, he didn't hear, it was like they were so far out, there was no sound at all. And so they had to work together. They eventually made it home, in case you're like worried about these boys. They eventually made it home. But they had to stop together. And what they agreed on is they weren't going to move forward until they all like had heard a sound, agreed that it kind of sounded like this, and they were going to slowly make their way in that direction. Now, when it comes to belonging, it's not true that all of our physical homes are the places that we picture when we think about where we belong. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But what I want to do is give you a few minutes. You're just going to have a couple minutes, about 5 here. And I want to ask you a couple questions. We each have our own internal compasses that can help us make our way to our deepest sense of belonging, our deepest sense of vocation. So here are the questions, and they're not like up there. So you're just going to have to hold on to them. And of course, I've given you more than you can actually do. So don't worry if you don't get to all of them. But number one, and I mean this metaphorically, but you can answer it literally if you want to. What does home sound like to you? What does home sound like to you? Number two, can you picture the people and the spaces that have positively shaped your deepest sense of belonging? Can you picture the people and the spaces that have positively shaped your deepest sense of belonging? And now here's a trickier one. How do you bring that with you into your work, into your studies, into your leadership, into your relationships, into the ways you interact with people or do homework assignments or guide strategy or make decisions or do the work of discernment. How do you bring your belonging with you into the spaces that you are? So what I want to do is give you about 5 minutes. If you have to, it looks like a lot of people like came with somebody, but if you have to introduce yourself to somebody, you have to do that. For the folks that are on joining us via live stream, you'll have about 5 minutes, maybe seven here. I know that's like 3 hours worth of conversation packed into 7 minutes, but go ahead and take a few minutes and I'll call us back in just a second. Okay. Okay. Thanks for doing that. I know you didn't like necessarily come prepped to talk about big things like your deepest sense of home. So uh it's good. And it's good for the soul to go there. And again, like I said, so much of the work that we do at the Dupree Center, it would just helping people deal with the really tough stuff and or big questions and feel those very deep moorings so that they know they can make decisions and be okay. So what does all this look? How many do like I see a couple people from this morning. You might get a little bit of reinforcement here. I won't call it repeat, but reinforcement here. But what does this look like to lead and work out of this place of belonging on a day-to-day basis? Right? That's kind of that last question you were going after and or can take away and think about it, especially during the times when our shoulders feel the pressure or joy feels at bay or we don't know what in the world to do. Several years ago, I developed a set of questions for a research project, and that this is in the book I wrote. But the four questions are this: how have you learned to define success? How have you learned to define failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? How have you learned to define success? How have you learned to define failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? Um, it is my sense that the deeper I'm thinking now of the leaders who were in that study I mentioned who felt like, who sensed a call, but the call was to follow, not to lead, that the deeper our sense of belonging is, whether it's been nurtured into us or we've had to create it, it really shapes the answers to those questions. It really shapes what we think success looks like and how we deal with failure. Um, Interestingly, in this study, there was no consensus on what success was. Absolutely no consensus. But there were some practices, and I want to just tell you these practices. Excuse me. I want to tell you these practices and then give you an everyday example of somebody doing their work and how this plays out. Okay, so the practices were empathy, imagination, risk, and reflection. Empathy, imagination, risk, and reflection. We've actually at the Dupree Center, the Road Ahead cohorts, we built a 6-week cohort around those things and it actually helps people discern and move from stuck to unstuck around big questions. And so this is kind of like a discernment method. And you'll notice the first one sort of attaches us to other people and that sense of belonging. Empathy, imagination, risk, and reflection. And let me tell you a story. This is a story of a woman named Mrs. Nahar. Mrs. Nahar was my daughter's kindergarten teacher. So I have met CEOs and college students and just lots of people who embody this or sort of learn to discern in this way. But I don't know that I have a more favorite example than Mrs. Nahar. So my daughter went to kindergarten in one of the years in a COVID year. Is that a thing? Are we still okay? Who knows? Anyway, she wore a mask in kindergarten. Let's just like sort of timestamps that, right? She wore a mask in kindergarten, and that was a lot on a lot of levels. By the way, I just saw that like last week was the 4-year anniversary of most countries going into a state of lockdown. So just kind of naming that for us. But Mrs. Nahar was a kindergarten teacher, and we had a parent teacher conference, and the parent teacher conference was in March, and it was on Zoom because it got canceled because somebody had COVID. Who knows exactly why? We're on Zoom. And the conversation, this is like our first big parent teacher conference. And I have a list of like 35 questions I want to ask that are just like not going to fit in this time, but I have them anyway. And so we start the Zoom session. And instead of starting with my 35 questions, I like somehow tapped into the human decency inside of me and started instead with, how are you doing? Right. And you ask people, how are you doing in a really genuine way? You get the most interesting responses. She said, remember, I have the sign on my head. She said, not good. I'm not doing good, Michaela. And I thought, ooh, I really want to get to my questions, but if I don't ask a follow-up, I'm going to be a bad human. So I decided to swallow my questions and say, tell me why. And she said, Michaela, it's March. I said, okay, yes, ma'am, it is March. And she said, usually they've all got one by now. They've all got one by now. What does that mean, Mrs. Nahar? All the kids usually have a friend by now. But I've got 4 who still don't have friends. And it's all of this stuff we're going through. Yeah, that sounds really tough. So what are you doing, Mrs. Nahar? She said she kind of like she was just in her classroom on Zoom. We were just like at her house on Zoom, but she leaned in like she was like making sure nobody else heard her, even though nobody else was in either room. And she said, you know what I did?" And I said, "What'd you do?" And she said, yes, just yesterday at recess, I started to notice a few little interactions between a couple of these kids. So I canceled math." "Wow, Mrs. Nahar, what'd you do next?" "Then we canceled language arts. Then we canceled science. We spent the whole afternoon playing on the playground." I'm like, oh, right. She said, I started to see it and they started to do the things. And so if you think about that, those 4 words, empathy, imagination, risk, and reflection, Mrs. Nahar is letting the sense of belonging and letting her empathy interrupt the plans. She's imagining, what if we did things a different way today? What if we put that big goal ahead of all these small goals that we've got? Not that the small goals don't matter, because they do, but not that day, not that afternoon, not on that playground. And then she took a risk. Can you imagine maybe like her colleagues looking out on the playground? They're like, well, the kindergartners are still out there. And she took a risk and she told us, parents, what'd you think? Right? She's kind of building in that reflection with us. And we said, thank you. Thank you for letting empathy interrupt. Thank you for listening to the kids. Thank you for nurturing this space of belonging. Thank you for taking the risks that you took. We're with you. And we thank you. Those things, the empathy, the imagination, the risk, reflection. I know I'm just kind of introing them, but those become sort of practical mechanisms for the day-to-day forward moving of how we enact our deepest sense of belonging, of how we make our way all the way to that outermost nesting doll. So let me end with this. Our identity as belongers shapes. Yeah, by the way, did I make up a word, belongers? I think I have. Every time I use it, like on my computer, it's like underlined with red. Just okay. So know that. Our identity as belongers shapes how we show up in the world. That is our central call and informs everything else we do. Who we listen to, what we can imagine, what we think redemptive work and the mission of God look like. So to nurture belonging in ourselves and each other and the spaces and the folks we have entrusted to our care is to nurture vocation. Those are actually 2 sides of the same coin. We will all take on water. Our shoulders are the size they are. The fog will inevitably roll in when we least expect it, which means that there is no better time to be attuned to our deepest sounds of home. Thank you.
Michaela, thank you very much for giving us much to think about here tonight. And I'm sure that those of you who are here with us this evening would agree with me that Michaela, I think, is a master storyteller in the way that she wove her various anecdotes in and through some very, very deep, deep thoughts. Michaela, if you'd like to come on back up for a second, we've taken the liberty of getting a little something to just say thank you for what you have had to share with us today. Dr. Amy Lean MacArthur is on her way, as is Ben. So, Michaela, thank you again very much for sharing with us tonight. Well, Ben's bringing out a seat, and we're going to invite Michaela to attend you. We hope that you have some questions that have been percolating as Michaela has been sharing, some things that you'd like to ask her about, to clarify, or to maybe speak to a little bit more. And so Amy and I are going to work either row. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll come up with a microphone, and Michaela will.
Never had chair service before. I like this.
Have you ever had to work with someone who is unfamiliar with where their home is and they cannot find that?
What's your name?
Noah?
Noah, that question is good and fitting of the name that's been given to you, right? Just saying. I mean that with gladness and gratitude. Absolutely. Yeah, it's tough. And if you were in chapel this morning, not suspecting that all of you were, there's a lot of letting go that has to happen. A lot of letting go. I am not a counselor. I'm the daughter of a trained like a therapist. And so a lot of my kind of inclinations start to go that way. And it's just like we started these cohorts to help people become more entrepreneurial. We wanted to help Christians be more entrepreneurial and participate in the work of God. And that's just not who came to us, Noah. People who came to us sometimes had a very clear sense of home and it was just kind of nested deep down within and they had to get to it. And sometimes getting to it's hard. And then other times it's got to be kind of reconstructed. And that's slow work. It's painful work and it's good work. So I don't, when things really go in that direction, I always recommend good counselors. I think that's a really, really important tool, particularly if our sense of home has been rocked by trauma and it's felt broken or shattered. Like that counselor relationship is really critical. So yes, I do see it at varying degrees of being buried when beneath the surface. That's a great question, Noah. And tell me your names when you ask questions.
Hi, Michaela. I'm Suki. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Very interesting what you're talking about. I wanted to ask you, in your study and everything that you encountered with those who were in sort of the business world, CEOs and things like that, you talked about discipleship. Could you kind of expand on that, what that kind of meant for them when they were in that place of belonging?
Yeah, it's a great question. So expanding on this sense of discipleship, the first line on the report out that we have is that the folks in this study were vivid and practical followers of Jesus. There's just a sense in their stories of a closeness, of a proximity, of a talking about, whether it was tough things like I had to fire and lay off this whole arm of this company, or I had to choose a decision that I was kind of standing alone because my faith sort of told me, we really shouldn't do that. It was these vivid, vivid stories. It was also a sense, and I think this is where the discipleship comes in, and discipleship basically meaning the way that I'll use a metaphor here, the way we walk in followership behind Jesus, right? To just kind of that. The other thing we saw is that, and I mentioned this in talking to some of the faculty, is that folks had developed the tough way, a very capable sense of being able to lean in when bad things happened. And that also kind of came up with the vividness. So there's a trust there. And again, it's not as if we're talking to people who tough things have never happened. Leadership at high levels is very tough. It's a very tough thing in the business world and other industries. There's a lot of decisions, a lot of complexities, a lot at stake, resource wise and in personnel. And people had things go different ways. But it was in those sometimes failures. Sometimes people would describe them more as crucible seasons, the heat, the fire, right? When the heat was up, that they also expressed a real sense of closeness to God. I don't know that I can articulate it much more than that right now, but that discipleship came out of a vividness of their stories. And we weren't asking a ton of leading questions of like, tell me all the ways that you follow Jesus on an everyday basis. It was more like, how do you deal with people and things like that. So just the vividness of how God came up in their everyday stories, and then the real surfacing of how they talked about God in these more crucible and challenging times. So great question, Suki. Thank you.
Go on. Yeah, oh, am I on?
Can't wait. It's going to be a stumper. The dean's asking a question. Okay.
Well, I was thinking a little bit about, I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul talks about remaining in the condition in which we are in when we're called. And I know throughout history, some have interpreted that as indicative of vocation not being a dynamic sort of thing, as you've described it, as a going in so well, way back when it might have been Calvin, I think, who was like, "Yeah, you're a bricklayer. You stay a bricklayer. That's your station. That's where you should remain." And do you have any thoughts on that particular scripture?
Yes, I love bringing up the reformers. Calvin and Luther were big on the station language. Yeah, actually, I think you have to look. So, okay, I'm going to do like 2000 years of church history in like a blip, and I won't do it in a super boring way. Okay, I think maybe we'll see. So in the early church, to have a vocation literally meant to be a follower of Jesus. That's what it meant. That's what a calling meant. There's a really good book by a man named William Placker who kind of sums up calling through the ages. Okay. So if you're like really interested in the history and how it's evolved, that's a good book. Then Constantine became the emperor of Rome, and he was a Christian. So all of a sudden it became cool and interesting and sort of socially favorable to be a Christian. And there was a resistance to that from within certain Christian circles that said, oh, we've really got to recover that sense of, it means to just follow Christ, and there's some risk involved here. And this is in conjunction with getting the rise of like the monastic movements. So in the Middle Ages, to have a calling meant to be set apart, even from society. Then you get Luther and Calvin and the reformers who did something really, really liberating for that time and context, which is to say, wait a minute, it's not just the special religious people who have callings. Everybody can have a calling from God, whether you're a baker or a candlestick maker or so on and so forth, that any station is just as valuable. And in fact, the language of serving and loving service to your neighbor is Lutheran as well. But here's the thing. That theology was developed in a pretty agrarian society, a society in which it was before the Industrial Revolution, before people moved to cities for jobs, before there were more dynamic natures of what human life looked like. And this is, I mean, I've in this way, I'm going to claim Luther for a second and Calvin alike as practical theologians. They were responding to the questions of the times. And I think by and large, our questions have continued to evolve. I think if someone sat here 30, 40, 50 years from now and talked about work and vocation and how they connect in exactly the way I do now, I would wonder if they'd been tracking. So while I think that the core sense that any job can be spiritually significant in the eyes of God absolutely, absolutely hangs on. I think that it can actually, in its worst version, be exploitive to sort of say, hey, we got to actually, like, you remain here. You remain there. A theologian by the name of Miroslav Volf wrote a book called Work in the Spirit, in which he sort of goes after some of these Reformation ideas. And one of the things is, how can we tell people who are sort of at the lower ladder of social mobility, who aren't even earning minimum wage or who are barely earning minimum wage and working 4 jobs, that they ought to stay put because God has them in a station? So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think in order to start to wrestle with that station language, you have to kind of look at the last couple, the last 2000 years of church history. So no surprise. Excellent question.
My side is really losing this right now. Guys, come on. Anybody? Any questions? I'm just joking. No pressure. But I'm here for you. I'm here for you.
My name is John Lean.
Hi, John.
I, I've often wondered that when you look at the work environment today, quite often it's very anti-Christian. You're not allowed to speak in that way at all. And so it gets back to what you were talking about on discipleship. As a Christian, we want to focus on Jesus. But how do you do that in an environment which is anti, Christianity?
It's a good question. So, in college, I had, I have like your favorite t-shirts. It's like the shirt you want to wear and you wear it until it can't be worn anymore. On one of those t-shirts for me it was the first time I had encountered this quote, and it was the Saint Francis of Assisi quote. Anyone know this quote? Uh, Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. I think that's one part of it, which is just, I love nothing more. So I was a film producer for 15 years in Los Angeles, and I love nothing more than when my filmmakers and my artists would show up on set, the first thing I would do was give them their check before they worked. They're like, I've never gotten a check before. I worked before. Yeah, we're going to do things differently here. And you're going to feel like you're in a different space. And I think there's so much opportunity for Christians to think redemptively about how work and business enact. And I love entrepreneurs for this reason, though it's certainly not just in entrepreneurship. So that's one part of it. The second part, just to highlight, there's a growing movement of what's called ERGs in big companies. I'm seeing a couple head nods. These are called employee resource groups. And kind of exactly for the reason that you've just described, Christians have fallen into a protected class with many other protected class to not be discriminated against. So one of my favorite things is I've had regular conversations with people who lead pretty big sort of employee resource groups for Christians at companies like Facebook and Apple and Google. It's actually really big in the Silicon Valley. And you think about the impact that these Silicon Valley tech firms are making on all of our everyday life. And so I also just have some rays of hope about very particular pockets and how I'm seeing belonging manifest in those. So one, I think we are who we are wherever we are. Preach the gospel necessary, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use the words. And also I'm seeing some pockets and some activity that indicate there could be a bit of a shift, even if that looks different than it did in, say, sort of mid-century North America, where Christendom was the primary operating framework of most people. So great question.
Yeah, does this work? My name is Sasha, and I'm a fourth year in business. And as we're like kind of finishing like my degree up, we've been talking a lot about the sacred secular divide, and just to kind of apply that to the business world. And yeah, so I kind of noticed that you mentioned that work and calling can get tangled up, but they should be like taken apart. Can you just like touch on that and like maybe explain the
Yeah,
difference?
great question. First of all, good for you. You're so close and it's almost happening. And one of my favorite books on this sort of sacred secular divide and bridging it is by a man named Jeff Van Duzer. It's called Why. Oh, did you read it? It's just the right text to be using in that question right there. So I love it. Um, I think so. When I say they need to be untangled, what I mean is that so often people define, I've met many people, let me put it this way. I have met many, many people who will say that a vocation is a job they love. Vocation is paid work. And that marrying those two so closely makes me uncomfortable for lots of reasons, primarily because of what we just talked about. The vocation goes a lot deeper than just what you do. Now, I would also like to think that, and I do, I believe in particular callings. I just don't necessarily, I don't think that yeah, I think I believe what I'm about to say. Let's test it out and see if I want to retract it. I just don't think it's true or fair that in this world that we live in, work included, that we're called to one special thing that stays that way and shows up as a job or career path. Now, it might be, so let's take me for example. I do feel called to lead, to teach, to create. I'm in a job where I get to do those things a lot. I do actually sense a particular calling to the role that I'm in now, but I did not sense a calling to start my business. And my business was the most beautiful, formative work thing I've ever done. And so I just want us to be careful how we talk about it. Vocation, a sense of God's calling to me, can be toward lots of things, each other, people, places, right? Yes, paid work, but not exclusively paid work. So it's why I like to think of them as like dancing partners. Like they're both in the dance work vocation, but they're not the same thing. I feel like, do we have an online question?
We
I saw like lots
do.
of hand waving in the back. Okay.
Hi, Michaela. It's Michael back here.
Hi, Michael.
We have a question online from Gordon. The question is this: the gap between Sunday to Monday seems so wide that the belong of Sunday is not forgotten, but is not relevant on Monday during the commute or walking into the office. What are 2 to 3 ways that you would suggest churches better prepare individuals on Sunday morning to be agents of reconciliation where they are at work on Wednesday afternoon?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Gordon and Michael, for delivering it. I hear this pain point a lot. I hear it from young leaders in Silicon Valley. I hear it from, I'm thinking about an executive I know in sort of the Rust Belt, United States. My church just doesn't get me. It doesn't talk about things. Even the church I go to, I'm like, come on, let's talk about this stuff a little more, right? So I just want to acknowledge that though even that just a lot of churches are not in the habit of bridging that gap. So specific things. And there's some organizations who do really good work here. There's a particular organization called Made to Flourish. It's based out of Kansas City in the United States. They do excellent work at this very particular thing. There's a project that is going on right now. I think your own chapel director, Stephen, was it Stephen? Yeah, Stephen. Okay. Stephen is part of it that is working on liturgies that talk and songs that talk about work to include in the worship service. So I want to encourage you that there's things being done. My first thing, and this is the empathy piece, is I wish I saw, and I would love to see, and I have great hope for churches listening, having mechanisms to listen more deeply to the daily work of people entrusted to their care. So that could take a bunch of varieties, whether it's something like a survey or whether pastors are doing rounds. I love when I hear pastors doing rounds, meaning that they actually go to different people's workplaces and they have like lunch with them there and they ask about it, right? Just shaping their imagination for this, then the sermons that come up on Sunday have these people in their minds and it's sort of like they can't help but talk about it. The second thing, and this is one I already mentioned, it depending on the kind of tradition you're in, high church, low church, is there formal liturgy? There's often some kind of sending prayers. I think this is one of the lowest hanging fruit ways to incorporate this stuff. And there's a project called worshipforworkers.com, probably, who knows? Worship for Workers, you look it up. They have a ton of these prayers and songs just like on their website. So you can just do that. Um, and then the third thing, I actually would recommend Made to Flourish has sort of an assessment thing that they do. And the assessment thing is an inventory of as I think as they phrase it, the vocational gifts that are in the congregation and sort of taking pulse on that and being able to rally energy around that. That is a huge way. Cause then you're talking about lay led efforts to bridge that Sunday to Monday gap, lay led efforts to bring Monday into Sunday, right? So great question, Gordon. Great. I can't wait.
Thank you, Michaela. I just wanted to ask you if you could sort of dissect when you were talking about the redemptive spirit and redemption in the business world. Like, what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, what do I mean by redemptive spirit in the business world? So I lead a doctoral cohort as part of my responsibilities at Fuller. This is a doctor of global leadership for folks who have terminal degrees in things other than theology. So lots of business people, healthcare professionals, some nonprofit professionals as well. And our title is our sort of like cohort title is redemptive imagination in the marketplace. And the best way I know how to say this is in thinking through what these students are imagining. There's a fantastic, I know I keep talking, like giving you books and resources, but there's a fantastic book by Walter Brueggemann called The Prophetic Imagination. And it's not a book on business, but it's a book on imagination and about enabling us to see more than what we see right now and to allow the ways of Christ to shape how we dream up new solutions. So a super simple example. I know that we're sort of getting at time here, so I'll give this example, and then if we need to wrap up, we can. This is a small thing. I was talking to a project manager at one point, and he was like, "My work, it just like I don't even know if it matters, and let's like I think I'm good at it, but it's kind of boring, and I certainly don't know how it fits in the redemptive mission of God." And I'm like, "Well, like, tell me about your week last week. What'd you do?" He's like telling me about his week. He's telling me about things. He tells me a story. He said, "Yeah, we had this thing and our project management software, it was kind of broken and it was causing people all this frustration and heartache. And they were just going around." And he's like, "So I fixed it." And I'm like, "Well, now what?" "Now it seems smooth and everybody seems like really good with it." And I'm like, "That's actually on that very tangible, like Tuesday morning example, you have just participated in the redemptive work of God. You have listened to the people. You have made something easier. You fixed a broken system. And then you can imagine how that would scale. All of a sudden, you're having, not necessarily that person, but you're having big conversations around what are economic systems that feel more redemptive? What are products that we should put in the world that feel like they seek the very best for people instead of exploit people? How do we think about profit margins from a redemptive standpoint? Might we maybe not go after all of this or invest this part back into the community? There's all kinds of models and conversations, but I want to tell that very, very just like everyday example because I think that it starts in those spaces.
Excellent. Michaela, thank you once again for sharing with us this evening. I'm sure she wouldn't mind hanging around for a few minutes. If you hadn't or haven't had a chance to ask a question or to connect with her, feel free just to wander down here, I think, to the front and engage in a little bit of conversation. Let me say thank you to each one of you for attending the lecture tonight, and to our friends online for joining us as well. If you've been inspired by what you've heard tonight, I would invite you to visit Michaela online at her website or on the Fuller Seminary website as well. Visit the CBM Vennture website and learn about the exciting work that's being done by Vennture, not only here in Canada, but all around the world. And don't forget to check out Crandall University's website and learn about some of the very interesting things that we're doing here, including some really cool stuff that our business program is engaged in right now. So, would you join me again in thanking Michaela for sharing with us tonight? Thank you. So safe travels, everyone. Good night and God bless.